Well, we're here tonight to listen to Dr. Timothy Walker. Timothy is not only a sailor, he's also a historian that revolves a lot about sailboats. He went to Hiram College through 1986. He's also a Boston University grad, as am I, proud terrier. He's got his Ph.D. from BU in 2001, a professor of history at the University of Mass, Dartmouth, a scholar of maritime history, colonial overseas expansion, and transoceanic slave trading. Timothy is a guest investigator at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, a contributing faculty member of the Munson Institute of Maritime Studies, which is also affiliated faculty of the Slavery North Initiative, and the director of National Endowment for the Humanities, Landmarks in American History Workshops series for middle and high school teachers. That's titled Sailing to Freedom, New Bedford and the Underground Railroad, 2011 to 2025. He's taught maritime history aboard numerous traditional rigged sailing vessels, including the Ernestina, the Morrissey, and the Letty G. Howard, the brig Niagara, and the ship, the HMS Rose. In 2020, Walker was appointed by the governor of Massachusetts to serve on the schooner Ernestina Morrissey Advisory Board, where he's the chair of the Educational Programming Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Timothy Walker.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I am excited to see such a wonderful turnout. Often I'm invited to do these things and there's a handful of people, but it's great to see a big room full of folks. And hello, Bart. Nice to see you again. So I am Timothy Walker, and the story that I want to bring and share with you this evening has to do, and I'm going to be completely open and transparent about this. I have an agenda. I want to change the way you think about the Underground Railroad. So I grew up in the Midwest. I'm a wash ashore to the East Coast. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, which was an important crossover point for people escaping enslavement to get to Canada. But I grew up outside of Dayton, Ohio. My mother was from Ohio, my dad was from Michigan. I grew up outside of Dayton. And as we will see, because I'm going to share a bunch of maps with you, this part of Ohio where I grew up was crisscrossed with trails of people escaping enslavement from northern Kentucky and from what is today West Virginia, and heading towards Canada over the Great Lakes. So I grew up, as did most of us, I'm sure, thinking about the Underground Railroad as an entirely land-bound thing. But then I moved to the East Coast, and I started sailing on large traditionally rigged vessels. And I started studying the history of the place where I moved, which was New Bedford, Massachusetts, which of course everybody knows about whaling and how New Bedford is an important port for whaling, but it also had the highest African American population per capita of any city in the north. And many of those people came from the south, and why were they there? They were escaping enslavement. So we're going to learn about this story, but I also I want to start to orient us, and actually, let me pause for a second to put my own slides up. 1 second, please. Okay, good. So the title of my talk tonight is called Sailing to Freedom, Uncovering and Recentering Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad. So this is a story about finding history that wasn't very well known and uncovering a story that wasn't really well known before, but also then taking that story and putting it right in the center of the Underground Railroad narrative, and asking people to think about the Underground Railroad in ways that they hadn't thought about it before. So here is a National Geographic map that kind of conveys the way the Underground Railroad is mostly taught. And this is what we all grew up with. Now, it does have a nod to people escaping offshore along the East Coast, and it has a nod to people escaping southward to the Caribbean and to Mexico, because by the 1830s there were many places in the Caribbean where slavery had been outlawed. Mexico was a place where slavery had been outlawed, and so people did escape south, but the overwhelming majority of them were going northward. Now, if this map is to be believed, this map would have us believe that people are escaping from central Alabama and central Mississippi and northern Georgia and the central interior Carolinas and going hundreds of miles overland by foot, by horseback, by carriage. And the problem with this map that I'm going to push back on is that the historical record does not back this up. The historical record instead says of all of the escapes on the Underground Railroad that we know about, that we can document, where we have evidence, the overwhelming majority of successful escapes on the Underground Railroad began just a few days' walk from the border with a free state. And so you have a lot of people escaping out of eastern Missouri or northern Kentucky or West Virginia or Maryland and Delaware. But what you don't have is a lot of people escaping very long distances overland. And the reason for that, if we start to think about it, the reasons for that are pretty obvious. It's hard. People don't know the terrain. They don't have a geographic knowledge. If you grow up illiterate, working on a plantation or within just a few miles of where you were born your entire life, you don't have a network of contacts. You don't have geographical knowledge that can help you to escape very long distances overland. It was virtually impossible to escape more than just a handful of days. You could follow the North Star, people understood that. But if they're going long distances overland, the overwhelming odds are that they're going to be intercepted, identified as a fugitive, and hauled back into enslavement. Now we have art of the Underground Railroad that depicts this. And we also have to think about the distances you could realistically travel overland. If you're going on foot, remember you're trying to travel by night, you have to remain clandestine and hidden. Maybe you could go 10 to 15 miles in a night, depending on if you had small children or women. One thing that you're not going to do, though, if you don't want to get caught, you're never going to carry a lantern. Because that's the kind of thing that you can see from miles away. So that didn't happen. If you were fortunate enough to have a horse, you might have been able to go 25 or 30 miles in a night. But it's slow. And everywhere, you're traveling essentially through hostile territory, where there are structures in place, law enforcement structures in place to stop you and to re-enslave you and to keep you from leaving your place of enslavement. There were systematic slave patrols set up all over the South with sometimes volunteers, sometimes vigilante bands that were set up specifically to look at likely routes of escape. And they were there specifically to find fugitives and to take what we have to remember was very valuable human property back to the rightful owners of that human property. And the rightful owners of that human property set up these patrols to keep them from losing their investments, which a prime young man who was likely to work quite a lot during their late teens and early 20s, their value was $50,000 to $60,000 per person in modern money, the equivalent of that. So the equivalent of a fairly nice car. Not only that, but people who were traveling legitimately, enslaved people who were traveling legitimately, had to carry evidence of their permission to be traveling and to be abroad at night or to be abroad in the countryside. They had tags. They often had these tags that identified the kind of work that they were doing, mechanic or servant or porter, and these various kinds of tags. They were registered in a registry book so that they could be identified, and it would be known if they had permission to be out for purposes of their assigned work. They also might have written permission slips from the people who owned them. And there were patrols that were checking these permission slips as people were traveling about. So the slave patrols would look at, and what we do have evidence of, is lots of handwritten documents in archives throughout the South. This one says, Grace has my permission to sleep something Saturday for 3 months from the date of October 3rd, 1849. And so she's been given permission to sleep at a neighboring plantation. And it's signed by either the overseer, Riddle, or the owner. And this is from 1849. We have lots of this kind of evidence. The point is, if you're traveling without this kind of documentation, without this kind of permission, you're going to get snapped up and returned to the place where you likely are owned as property. Most enslaved people were not literate. In fact, it was illegal to teach people to read and write. And so most enslaved people could not produce these kinds of documents for themselves. Not only that, but there was the problem of the slave patrols having other tools to hunt people down, specifically dogs. Dogs that were specially trained to go after enslaved people. And so all of these impediments to overland travel would keep you from successfully traveling long distances. Your best chance to get away was to leave on a holiday when people were not likely to be as vigilant, and your best chance was to leave when you're really close to the border with a free state. And most people working in the South did not have that possibility. By contrast, if you could somehow get on a ship, even in the far South, getting on board a vessel in Charleston, South Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, and get offshore and into the Gulf Stream that's going to push you along at 6, 7 knots up the East Coast. You could be from Charleston, South Carolina to New York or Boston in a week with best conditions. Not only that, but once you're aboard the vessel, you have nothing to do. You don't have to hide. You might have to feed yourself. But your job at that point is simply to walk along. Now, you could be aboard a vessel with the permission of the crew, and that was the best case scenario where people are actively aware that you're there and they can help you and they can feed you. But if you're a genuine stowaway and people don't know that you're there, still, you might be able to find a place, if you've brought along some water and some food, you could keep yourself hidden below deck in the cargo for long enough to make your way to a free port. It was fast, and there were very few possibilities that you were going to be intercepted and caught once you're on board a vessel. That's why this whole story of sailing to freedom makes so much more sense. What we can say after years of research is that very few people escaped overland from the far South, but almost everyone who escaped from the far South did so on a vessel. Almost everyone. There are some exceptions, and it's mostly from the coastal Deep South. So here's another map. I love this map because it was done by a professor in the late 19th century, 1898 it's published. This is a guy who was a historian at the Ohio State University in Columbus, and he interviewed personally operatives of the Underground Railroad, and those people who he didn't interview in person, he wrote to them through correspondence. He was able to get their stories. And what he did was he geographically documented these red lines are all the escape routes that he was able to document on the Underground Railroad. So I was born in Detroit, pretty important crossover point, but I grew up outside of Dayton, Ohio, and I grew up with all of these stories about safe houses and even tunnels and methods of keeping people secreted away as they were making their way towards freedom in the North. Notice a couple things here. The Underground Railroad only operates north of the slave states, with the exception of a few ports like Norfolk and Charleston, South Carolina, and some places in the Delaware Bay. Delaware was a slave state up until the Civil War. So Siebert was able to document that there were Underground Railroad operatives in southern ports, but not in inland cities. I'm going to hold that thought till a little bit of time. So this is how I got started in this. I came to New Bedford thinking about overland Underground Railroad. But I was soon approached by a real dynamo of a woman whose name is Lee Blake, who runs the New Bedford Historical Society. Now, New Bedford has two historical societies. One is called the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. That's what the Whaling Museum is. But then there's another historical society called the New Bedford Historical Society, and it focuses entirely on the stories of people of color. Not just people of African descent, but also Wampanoag Indians and Cape Verdeans and other people of color in New Bedford. And Lee Blake came to me and said, hey, there's this story that we should tell. New Bedford was a terminal point on the Underground Railroad. It was a destination on the Underground Railroad. Why? Because the whaling business was in the hands of Quakers. And Quakers, by the late 18th century, the late 1700s, they were abolitionists. And so New Bedford became known as a safe haven, literally and figuratively, for people of color escaping enslavement. So she said, hey, let's apply for some money. And I said, yeah, let's apply for some money from the National Historic, from the, what am I applying from? The NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we were really fortunate to get funding 5 times, and we ran a workshop for teachers in 2011, 13, 15, 22. We were supposed to run it in 2025, but the current administration clawed back all that NEH money, so we didn't get to run it again. But we had teachers coming from all over the United States. We served more than almost 300 teachers from at least 30 of the 50 states. And so now the story of New Bedford and the Underground Railroad is all over the United States being taught to school children. But what we started to figure out in the midst of doing this, and neither Lee nor I knew this, was that we started to uncover the stories, and we found more and more people who were arriving not overland, as we had assumed, but they were arriving by water. They were documenting that they had escaped from the coastal South by ship, either by stowing away, or often more likely, with abolitionist-minded sailors who were crew on ships from the north going to the south, and encouraging people to get on board and to escape to the north. Now, in 1998, there was a book that came out called Blackjacks, which I bet some of you have read. This is Jeffrey Bolster's book, and it documented the incidents of mostly free black mariners, but also some enslaved black mariners working on American merchant ships and Navy ships too. It turns out that in the first quarter of the 19th century, early 1800s, almost 20% of the entire seaborne workforce of the United States on American flagged vessels were people of color. Most of them were free, some of them were enslaved, and if they're enslaved, they're paying their wages over to their owners. So what we then have is a picture of, along the East Coast, there are so many waterways and inlets. There are no bridges, there are no highways, there are no superhighways. Everything moved by water. And so up and down the East Coast, this is Boston Harbor in the 1770s, you have clouds of shipping, sloops and schooners and brigs and full-rigged ships going up and down the East Coast, carrying the lifeblood of America. They are bringing stuff into ports, international shipping too, but mostly a lot of this is domestic shipping, just carrying goods up and down the East Coast, bringing plantation-produced agricultural goods from the south, industrial goods from the north, going back and forth all the time. The seas close to the coastline were highways of commerce, and that is the lifeblood of the country. And 20% of the guys working on those ships are black, African-descended, highly skilled mariners. So there's that. Then we also have to think about the fact that in the southern ports, where slavery was legal, most of the northern states outlawed slavery within 10 years of the American Revolution being over. But south of the Mason-Dixon, almost all of the labor in southern ports was being done mainly by enslaved workers. They're working on the waterfronts. There are very few white people there, but in the waterfronts of the South, you have the entire labor force being mostly enslaved Africans. There were some white masters of ships, there were some agents, there were a few handful, but most of the labor there are black people. And what are they doing? They're doing everything. They are waterfront dock and wharf workers. They're longshoremen and stevedores doing the pretty skilled labor of loading and unloading ships, because you have to load a ship properly so it will sail right, that it'll be in good trim. They're warehousemen, they're drovers and teamsters, bringing provisions and cargo to the port and taking it away. They are very skilled shipyard labor. They are caulkers and riggers and sailmakers, and doing all the stuff to keep the commerce of the United States flowing. Not only are they working on the waterfront, but they're also working on the water itself. They are skilled watermen, they're fishermen, they are oystermen, they are running ferries, they are running lighters to load and unload ships that are on a mooring or on a buoy. This is probably one audience where I don't have to explain that. They are deckhands and pilots, but they are often working with great autonomy by themselves, with black captains controlling black crewmen, all of whom are enslaved and autonomous, and learning valuable strategic skills. Up the waterways of the South, they are loading cargo from agricultural plantations. They're loading tobacco and rice and cotton and bringing that down the inland waterways, those saltwater tidal creeks, bringing it down to harbors and then loading it on vessels so that it can go out to market. Working on the waterfront, they gain strategic knowledge. They know when the forces of enforcement are present in the port. They know when ships are about to clear customs and leave to go north. They know where the ships are from. They know, because they've been loading the vessels, they know where the hidey holes are. They can set up gaps in bales of goods where they can secret themselves or their friends away. They are creating the circumstances that will allow a small percentage of people to get away every single year. If we look at where the enslaved population is concentrated in the South, this is a map from 1860, right on the cusp of the Civil War. And you can see that these darker areas are where you have very large majorities of people of African descent, enslaved people. The very darkest ones are 70 and 80% African. They are right in the places along where the major ports are, where the waterways are, where the plantations are, and they are moving all of the goods that keeps the Southern economy going. The South couldn't afford to stop runaways by changing over their entire workforce on the waterfront. They accepted losses as a cost of doing business, but they weren't happy about it. And they started trying to do everything possible to keep people from running away using waterborne means. Especially if you look at, in Virginia, the big rivers like the James River and the York River and the inland waterways, all of the big plantations are right next to the water because the water was the way that you moved heavy, bulky goods. You couldn't move them by road. You had to be connected to the waterways. If you saw the other half of the map, and you see the line of the Mississippi River, it is jet black on either side because that's where all of the enslaved population was working on the plantations. Here's a kind of close-up view just of South Carolina. And these coastal waterways that are all tidal, they're all being navigated by enslaved watermen who know where the navigational hazards are. They know the charts off the back of, they know them almost instinctually after having grown up with them. They're a tremendous, valuable resource. And as my slide here says, strategic knowledge equals opportunities for escape.
Excuse me, Tim?
Yeah.
So the body of people you're talking about are still enslaved, so they are owned by some guy.
Almost all of them. There are a very small handful of free black people in some of the ports who are working with agents, but 98% of them were enslaved prior to 1865.
So these guys are all working on the waterfront with this huge anvil hanging over their head.
That, but they're also working with great autonomy because they're earning a lot of money for their owners.
Their owners,
Their
not
owners.
the owner of the ship.
Correct. Well, both. But yes, the people who own these slaves, if they're working on the waterfront, they're probably working for wages, and those wages go to the owner, the slave's owner. But often the slaves are, like the owner might be inland, might be in Charleston. They don't see their enslaved man or woman, mostly men, for months at a time. So long as they keep returning their monthly wages, the enslaved person can work with great autonomy and very little oversight. Yeah, go ahead.
Taking questions. So were these sort of charity vessels that took these people to freedom, or did they have to pay for it? And how was that marketed? Was it secret?
Both are possible. Let me continue with the story, and some of this will come out in the fullness of the story. But to answer your question directly, when there were abolitionist-minded sailors who wanted to help people to escape, that was usually an act of Christian kindness and charity. But it was also, and I say Christian because that was a big part of the abolitionist mindset and identity. But there were other captains who did it for money. And there were other captains who did it unawares, and people actually literally stowed away without the knowledge of the crew and managed to get away as well.
For a week, how did they go to the bathroom and not be found out?
Well, the bilges of a of a wooden vessel were never particularly cleanly. We know that this is happening a lot because Southern politicians are complaining about it, because people don't want to let go of their valuable archives. But what we've done is we've gone into archives and systematically tried to find runaway slave ads that mention waterborne escape. We first found dozens, and then scores, and then hundreds, and now thousands of these within that body of 220,000 runaway slave ads. So here's one example, and they start actually quite early. This is 1772, Williamsburg, Virginia. Beware of the elongated S, which looks like an F. So this is a guy, his name is Phil, he's about 20 years old, 5'9" high. He's a native of Africa. He speaks broken English, but he has experience with vessels. As he has been used to the sea, he will probably endeavor to get on board some ship and make his escape out of the colony. All masters of vessels are therefore forewarned from harboring or carrying him off at their peril. So there's a threat to people helping human property escape, but there's also, and these ads are placed by the owners or by their agents. And so the ads have several components. They name the person, they give a physical description, they usually say what they were wearing, but then the owner almost always gives some information because he wants his property back. He's giving information about how he thinks his human property has gotten away. And surprisingly, at first, and now it makes sense, many of these stories involve escape by water. So here's one. Here's another one. This is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1796. This is your first test tonight. $10 reward, absconded from the household of the President of the United States. Who was President of the United States in 1796 in Philadelphia? George Washington. So this is Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl, black eyes, about 20 years of age. Most of these folks are young, especially if they go off by themselves. And so here's the part I've highlighted. But as she may attempt to escape by water, all masters of vessels and others are cautioned against receiving her on board, etc. So Oni Judge was a young member of the household staff of George Washington. The capital of the country was in Philadelphia. She had come from Mount Vernon with him. And because Pennsylvania had eliminated slavery, but they had a grandfather clause for owners of slaves who could bring their enslaved people for up to 6 months. And Oni was worried that she was going to be rotated back to Mount Vernon, and she was also worried that she was going to be sold to someone that she didn't like. And so she decided Philadelphia is a major seaport. She in fact did get on board a ship. She sailed down the Delaware Bay and up the east coast of the United States. She ends up in New Hampshire, where she, I hope you'll be happy to know, she lived out the rest of her life in freedom. George Washington, for his part, lived the rest of his life trying to get her back. And even as President of the United States, he didn't have the authority to tell the state authorities to give her back. And so this is a story that She publishes a biography, which is fascinating reading in the 1820s, but she lives the rest of her life in freedom. Washington only lived 3 more years. He dies in 1799, but he was never able to get his property back. This is 1810, Baltimore. This is a broadside. It's something that was printed and stuck up on walls around the city. It's about a guy named Jack. He's 5'8" or 9", and his object is to go to sea, and he will be trying to ship on board some vessel out. Note below, all masters of vessels and others are forewarned, harboring or taking off said Negro at their peril. So as time rolls on, laws start to be enacted that have teeth to prosecute anyone who is helping someone to escape. Many of us here will probably know about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required northern states to help federal authorities bring enslaved people back to the South. That was the first time that happens in 1850. It's one of the precursors to the Civil War. But there's an earlier Fugitive Slave Act in 1793. And that act said that any mariner, any sea captain, who could be shown to have knowingly helped someone to escape was liable to prosecution. A sea captain who helped someone to escape, or crew members who helped someone to escape, could have their vessel impounded, could have their cargo impounded, they could be forbidden from doing business in a southern port. It really was an attack on their livelihood. However, free black and enslaved people had much greater risks because the law fell differently on them. A free black person who helps an enslaved black person to escape, that's a capital offense in many southern municipalities. And for an enslaved person who helps another slave to escape, that means they're going to be sold away from the waterfront to agricultural work, which is much harder and much more deadly, where the life expectancy was reckoned in less than a decade for most people working on southern plantations. So there were real, and increasingly over time, real penalties to helping people to escape from enslavement out of southern ports. This is 1838, North Carolina, the Wilmington Advertiser. And I put this up here because it has some other details that are really interesting. As very little doubt can be entertained of his conveyance away on board some vessel, I will give the further reward of $500 for the conviction and punishment agreeable to law of the master or captain, and half that sum for any of the crew or other person engaged in this felonious act. $500 was a lot of money in 1838, and it speaks to the value of the property, but also trying to create penalties that would act as a deterrent for this kind of activity. A couple more. This shows that the Southern slave owning class was very concerned about those watermen helping their enslaved property to escape. So here we have Mary and William, and both of them have had for a long time relations with the Negro fishermen in the bayou. So the owner is certain that the fishermen are helping their enslaved property to escape. This is not a runaway slave ad, but this one is very close to home, especially where I live, because it's from the New Bedford Medley or Marine Journal. It's from 1797. And this is not a runaway slave ad. Instead, it is a legal notice in response to that first Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. So here we have a captain, William Tabor, same family as Tabor Academy, public notice. Now, here's where you have to make some decisions about the captain's motivations. And we kind of have to read between the lines to see what's really going on here. So let's read it and see if we can find out. Public notice, to all whom it may concern, know ye that I, William Tabor, commander of the sloop Union, sailed from the York River in Virginia on or about the 28th of March last, bound to this port, New Bedford, that on the day after sailing I discovered a Negro on board said boat, or sloop, who had concealed himself unbeknownst to me. I knew nothing about it. This guy just turned up on my ship.
Not my fault.
Not my fault. Well, remember, you have to be proved to have done this knowingly. Here's where it gets interesting. So, unbeknownst to me, it appearing inconsistent for me to return, the wind being ahead, I proceeded on my voyage and landed him in this port, New Bedford. I don't have a motor, I'm a sailboat. I was out and the weather compelled me to keep going north. I could not turn around and bring this legal property to the property's legal owner. I had to continue on my way. He calls his name James. Is that his name? We don't know. He's about 27 years old and says he belongs to Mr. Shackelford, a planter in King and Queens County, Virginia. Any person claiming him will know by this information where he is, for which purpose it is made public in this manner, and every legal method has been taken to prevent the owner losing the property in my power. William Tabor, April 20th, 1797. Well, newspapers did circulate up and down the East Coast, and so at some point the owner probably would get handed a copy of this, Mr. Shackelford, and say, oh, that's where James is. But this was a weekly publication, and it would take months, possibly, to get down. So at that point, James could be anywhere. But the captain has covered his butt legally, and he has given himself legal cover so that he will not be prosecuted because he's made the case. And you're not going to argue with the captain because the captain's word is law at sea. And if he says that he didn't know, then he is free from prosecution and his boat is free from impoundment. He might be judged wanting and be prohibited from ever trading again in the York River in Virginia, but that's a lot better than losing your vessel and going to jail. Now, there were some forces at sea that could have stopped and searched vessels at sea. We have the United States Customs Service, which at the time was known as the Revenue Service, revenue cutters. You may be familiar with some of these vessels, but in the late 18th and 19th century, maritime law said that international waters began 3 miles out. And most of these vessels are transiting the coast well offshore. And so they're in international waters within an hour or so of having left the home port. And so once they're in international waters, they can't legally be stopped and searched, not by the U.S. Customs. And so that also made it less likely that anyone would interfere with someone escaping.
Even if they're US flag vessels.
Oh yes, correct. If they're in international waters, they're not going to be stopped outside of 3
So
miles.
the revenue guys could only tag you if you were inside 3 miles.
Correct. Southern states and southern municipalities, harbors, were very concerned about those free black sailors, the 20% of the guys who were on the boats, because they were absolutely certain that these guys were encouraging their property to run away. And so they started beginning in 1822 in South Carolina, and then later you see the dates for the other states, but they enacted laws to impede the movement and the freedom of free black mariners serving on vessels coming into southern ports. My colleague, Michael Schopner, has written a wonderful book called Moral Contagion. The contagion was free black guys contaminating enslaved people with the idea that they might possibly be freed in the north. But what happens is the southern states enact laws saying, if you're a free black man and you sail into a southern port as part of the crew, we are either going to confine you to your vessel, you can't leave the boat on the dock, or we're going to incarcerate you on land for the time that your vessel is in the harbor. And the costs of that confinement are going to be borne by your captain. The vessel is going to be charged for holding crew members in jail during the time that they're in harbor. And this, of course, is a huge disincentive to captains who are wanting to hire African sailors to come into southern ports. But the African sailors say, we're not going to go in under these conditions. We might be re-enslaved. We might be falsely identified as enslaved, as not free black men. They carried sailors' seamen's certificates that identified them as free black men, but that didn't mean that unscrupulous people wouldn't tear up those papers and sell them into slavery. So it became very dangerous. The other thing that southern ports did is they started systematically searching vessels that were going north. They would have searching stations as ships were leaving harbor. They would be boarded and searched. They might even be fumigated. This is a certificate of searching. And by the way, again,
The costs for this are borne by the vessel that's trading in that harbor, so they have to pay a fee, and then it's a not inconsiderable fee. $5 in 1857 was a significant amount of money. They might be fumigated, burning sulfur and brimstone below decks. It was used to kill rats, but it could also drive out anyone hidden below decks, and that was the whole point, was to try to find fugitive slaves and catch them before they got out of the harbor.
That must have screwed up the commerce at some level.
You can only do that with certain kinds of cargoes.
No, I mean the pressure on the masters to not show up in that port
Oh, right.
because of their crew.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it could have done, but there were certain ports where you could only, like, if you wanted a particular kind of good, it was available in only a few places. So. The other evidence that we have are runaway slave narratives, and there are a lot of them. And curiously, of the more than 100 runaway slave narratives where someone escaped from enslavement and then wrote about it, first of all, people in the maritime world had a much higher likelihood of being literate, and they often learned literacy on the waterfront. But of the more than 100 runaway slave narratives that we have, 70% of them involve escape by water. Now, in some ways, that's a self-selected group, but it's still quite striking that 70% of the narratives that we have involve runaways by water. So here's a good one. Thomas Jones is a really great example. He had been a longshoreman in Wilmington, North Carolina for decades. In 1849, he manages to get aboard a brig called the Belle, and he stowed away. He didn't have help from the crew. The captain worried that he was going to be prosecuted, so when they got to New York, he anchored 2 miles offshore and went on shore to find a federal marshal. He was going to turn Thomas Jones over to the federal marshal. Thomas Jones took the opportunity to cobble together some kind of raft. It probably didn't look as nice as this, but he was going to try to swim to shore. And he's pursued by the first mate and some of the crew, but providentially, he encounters 2 New England abolitionist sailors who get him into their boat and get him onto shore, they get him into a safe house, and he ends up going to New Bedford and then to Boston, where he publishes in 1862, just as the Civil War is getting started, he publishes his book, The Experience of Thomas Jones, who was a slave for 43 years. And this is entirely available online. You can search this up and find the original text digitized for your enjoyment. This is Harriet Jacobs, who famously wrote a book about incidents in the life of a slave girl. When the book is published, she had escaped from Edenton, North Carolina, but she had spent 7 years in a small attic waiting for an opportunity to get aboard a ship. And her owner was looking all over for her. She was in the attic of her grandmother. But she manages to get aboard this vessel. She goes to New Bedford and Philadelphia, and she writes a book in which, in gentle, sanitized language, she talked about the dangers of being a female enslaved person and the kinds of abuses that she received at the hands of her master. So this is a famous and well-known book that documented the experience of women, but her brother also escaped. And this is an incredible story as well. Her brother, John Jacobs, also from Edenton, escapes to New Bedford, gets aboard a whaling voyage, because if you want to avoid being recaptured, what better way to do it than to be on the other side of the world catching whales for 2 to 3 years, which was the average length of a whaling voyage, earn a little bit of money, but he jumps ship and eventually goes to Australia, where, in Melbourne, he publishes this scathing indictment of slavery in the United States. It's published on the front pages of the Melbourne newspaper over 2 weeks. He comes back, he works in the Merchant Marine, he has himself painted with a copy of the Liberator newspaper, which was the big abolitionist newspaper published by William Lloyd Garrison up in Boston. All of this story was not known 4 years ago. My colleague at RISD, Jonathan Schroeder, identified the painting, which was at the African American Museum of Philadelphia. They didn't know who this was. And John Schroeder also in Australia found the manuscript of the original publication, and then he published it with Chicago University Press in 2024. So now it's available, and it's just an extraordinary read. the title references the number of slave owners in the United States. The United States governed by 600,000 emancipates. And this guy pulls no punches. John Jacobs was absolutely lethal in his condemnation of enslavement. Well, another story with a local touch. This is Daniel Drayton, who was the captain of the schooner Pearl, this is the single largest escape attempt in U.S. history that we know of. A captain of a schooner. He wrote in his memoir, he's talking about navigating as a commercial captain in the Chesapeake Bay. And he says, no sooner does a vessel known to be from the north anchor in any of these waters than she is boarded in hopes of obtaining a passage to a land of freedom. So people are swarming over the gunwales, trying to find a trip north. It was absolutely commonplace. And the captain writes about this. Well, he was down on his luck. He is recruited by some abolitionists in New Bedford and Boston to try to break a bunch of people out of slavery. And he has this rickety old schooner called the Pearl, which was very small, 65-footer. And he ties up at the waterfront in Washington, D.C. And he's supposed to take off the family of a blacksmith who was working in the Navy Yard in D.C. Blacksmith had 8 children and 2 grandchildren. And he had freed himself, but he was worried that his family was going to be broken up, so he wanted to get them away. Word got out, and 77 enslaved people showed up to get aboard the ship. And Daniel Drayton took them on board, all 77, aboard a very small vessel, and he heads down the Potomac River in the middle of the night. Well, the jig was up because many of the people that he's taking away are property of some of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C. Like the human property of members of the United States government, the human property of the Treasury Secretary, someone who had been owned by James and Polly Madison, and Dolly Madison, sorry. And so these people are on board, and when sunrise comes up and people are not getting their tea or they're having their household chores being done, people begin to realize that a bunch of folks have absconded. But there was also a taxi driver who alerted some of the authorities because he had brought some of these enslaved people to the dock, and he felt that there was something suspicious going on, so he reported them. These very powerful people got a steamship, and they followed a posse of men, 35 men, come down, and right at the mouth of the Potomac River, it's about to go into Chesapeake Bay, the wind died, the schooner had no auxiliary engine, and so they were forced to anchor and wait for a favorable wind, and the little steam vessel shows up with the posse on board, and they're all arrested. Daniel Drayton was nearly lynched in the streets of Washington, D.C., but he ends up serving a 4-year prison term. He's pardoned by Millard Fillmore. He comes back to New Bedford, and he speaks to some of the people who had hired him. He ends up, and this is a very sad story, he ends up taking his own life in this hotel, which is on Union Street in New Bedford. It's where the YMCA is now. And his tomb, which was maintained by the free black community in New Bedford, is about 3 blocks from where I live. And so I took that photo of his tombstone. So his story does not end well. But he was revered in the abolitionist community and in the free black community for having tried to get this large number of people away to freedom. There are other stories. Elizabeth Blakely, whose story, she escapes in 1850. She's 14 years old. She gets really bad frostbite because she escapes in the winter, and her voyage was 2 weeks. And she wasn't known, the people on board didn't know she was there, but her story isn't published until the 1920s because she was so afraid of. And this is something that we need to think about. All of the activity I'm describing for you is clandestine, it's illegal, and so it doesn't leave much of a paper trail. People always ask me, well, how many people actually escape? We'll never know. And it's because they don't leave a paper trail. We can estimate, but we never know how many hundreds or thousands actually. The ones that we find out about are the ones that got caught. But the ones who got away, we don't typically know very well. Wonderful story. Austin Bierce is an abolitionist working in the harbor of Boston. He has a yacht in 1853 called the Moby Dick. The book had just come out a few years before, and he names his yacht after Melville's book. Maybe. But what they would do is, when a ship came in from the south, they would send out a woman to sell trinkets to the sailors, pies and cakes and bits of clothing. And she would, usually it was an African, a free black woman in a small boat, going to the ships, arriving newly in harbor, and she would inquire discreetly, do you have any contraband on board? And if the answer was yes, then they would go out in the middle of the night with the yacht and take the person off and get them into a safe house, in an Underground Railroad safe house, and then get them north and out of the city. This is one of my favorite, by the way, how are y'all doing? Yeah, you're fine? I mean, I've got a number of other examples, but I don't want to.
Keep going.
Okay, all right.
Not wanting to scream.
Okay, this is my third lecture for the day, so I've taught classes already. Captain James Watson Fountain in the schooner City of Richmond. This is a packet boat that runs a regular route north and south, and he was suspected of systematically taking away, stealing human property. And so in Norfolk, Virginia, he's boarded by a council of the city who are empowered to search his vessel. And they say to him, we're going to search your vessel because we think that you're taking people. And he is indignant. He grabs an axe and he says, I'll show you that I have no one hidden away aboard my vessel. And he starts to hack into the deck of his own packet ship. And back away, because what captain in his right mind would tear up his own ship? And so they said, okay, we believe you, we'll let you go. And he had 21 people on board. He had 21 people aboard at this moment, and he gets them to Philadelphia and into safety. In Philadelphia, there was a guy named William Still, who was a very famous operative of the Underground Railroad. He ran a safe house on Delhi Street, just a couple blocks from the waterfront in Philadelphia. And he did something that was very imprudent. William Still was a free black man, and he's running this safe house, and he is keeping careful notes of all of the people that he helped. And if he had been caught, that would have been the end, because he wrote down all the evidence. Well, thankfully, he wasn't caught, and so he publishes that book in 1872, after the Civil War and after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that abolished slavery. And he had recorded, I think it's 700 or 800 incidents of helping people to escape. And so this is the way that a lot of historians know about this. And most of the people that he's helping, these are images from the original book in 1872, where he's recounting these stories. I love this photo because it kind of encapsulates why escaping by water was so superior to escaping over land. First of all, entire families could escape aboard ships. They are under cover of darkness. Notice that the Underground Railroad operatives are also people of color and white people who are working together to help people to get to freedom. They're putting them into carriages with covered windows, so prying eyes can't look inside and see who's in there, traveling through Philadelphia at night. People who couldn't easily travel over land. Children, babies, people who were heavy. This means that they can go by water, but they can't easily go over land and not make any rapid progress. So I like that image a lot. Here's a Buzzards Bay story. Great story. Dempsey Hill was a waterman. He had worked on pilot boats in North Carolina, in Beaufort. And once the Civil War broke out, he knew that there were really valuable charts in the customs house in Beaufort, North Carolina. So he stole them. And he hid them in a cemetery for a couple of days. And then he gets some buddies together who are also watermen, and they steal a pilot boat, and they go out to the blockading Union Navy, and they fly a white flag, and they say, we'd like to escape, please. And they escape by water. They are immediately brought into the U.S. Navy as able-bodied seamen, because they have skills. They not only talk the talk, they walk the walk, and he serves in the U.S. Navy throughout the war, and then he establishes a business here in Buzzards Bay up by Onset, where he's a fishing boat captain. He takes people out on pleasure cruises. And what I find so incredible about this is when he dies in 1894, the Boston Globe runs a full column obituary about this guy because he was so revered and valued as a pleasure boat captain. And that's what this is from. How many people of color got an obituary in the Boston Globe at the end of the 19th century? Almost none, but he does, and that's pretty extraordinary. Well, this is the map from our book, and these are all the people that we document escaping by water. And if you line that map up with the earlier map that I showed you, you can see how much sense it makes. People are escaping out of the places where there were a lot of people of color who were enslaved. I have a few more slides, and they focus on New Bedford. So if you will indulge me, I'll give you just a little bit of time about, so this is from the 1840s. The probability is she has gone towards New Bedford as she has a father living there. New Bedford, by the 1840s, had a reputation as a safe haven for escaped slaves. And in the South, the Southern slave-owning class really disliked the fact that New Bedford was harboring a lot of their human property to get away. It's one of the reasons that the New Bedford maritime community sent the granite stone fleet down to blockade harbors in the South when the Civil War began. But New Bedford was known as the very familiar image on the cover, and New Bedford was known as this place where fugitives could escape and be safe. No one was ever taken back into enslavement from New Bedford. Philadelphia can't say that, Boston can't say that, New York certainly can't say that. New Bedford never had anyone taken back by the bounty hunters who were sent to collect people who had run away from enslavement. So the reason for this is an image of New Bedford in 1839, the year after our most famous fugitive, Frederick Douglass. New Bedford is his first home in freedom. So here's an image of the harbor before the big hurricane barrier was built. The bridge was still there. And this was a place that, because of the whaling industry, hundreds of ships sailing in and out, there was always a need for labor, both as crewmen on the whaleboats, but also the waterfront workers to keep the whaleboats sailing, to do the rigging, the sail making, the baking, the caulking, the repair work. There was always labor for anyone who had maritime skills to escape from the South and come to New Bedford. But there were earlier examples of black abolitionist Quakers, including Absalom Boston, who lived from 1785 to 1855. He's one of the earliest African American. He's also of Wampanoag descent. And he was a captain of whale ships with all black crews in the 1820s, really early. Another one you may have heard of is Paul Cuffey, probably the wealthiest person of color in the early 19th century in the United States, sued the state of Massachusetts for the right to vote, pioneered integrated schools in Westport, Massachusetts, takes a ship shortly after the American Revolution to England and sails into Liverpool with a merchant ship with an all-black crew, and it makes the papers in London. The Times of London publishes a story about this. So he's an extraordinary guy, and we have a park dedicated to him in New Bedford, but his story is not well known enough. One of his family, a guy called Thomas Wainer, had a reputation for stealing people from the South. So the part that I've highlighted, here's a guy named Harry who's 23 years old who has run away. And this is also a notice in the New Bedford newspaper where an owner is really upset that his property has probably gone to the New Bedford region. So Harry is supposed to be carried off by a certain Thomas Wainer of Westport, Massachusetts, a mulatto who traded here and cleared out as captain of a small vessel from Westport, came to the port of Snow Hill, Maryland, where he got a load of corn and staves, and cleared for Norfolk, Virginia, whence, he said, he was intended for Westport, whither I suppose him to have gone. And so it's an article published in New Bedford to complain about a local captain who was suspected of stealing people away. And he probably was. But at that point, he's beyond the law. William Cuffey's son, Paul Cuffey's son, William, was the master of a whaling ship called the Rising States with an all-black crew. The aforementioned John, who had published the story, John Jacobs, was also a crew member of the Rising States at one time. So we can look at the crew list, and you can see their physical attributes: skin complexion, black, 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 dark, and then hair is woolly. So they're describing these who are clearly people of African descent. We have lots of evidence of this in New Bedford. The whaling industry is probably the best documented early modern industry in the world, because the whaling families wrote everything down and they kept it. And we have it right at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Frederick
There's a
Douglass.
school in Providence called Paul Copy School.
Absolutely, yeah. Yep. Douglass comes in 1838. He's using a seaman's protection paper to travel, but because he looked the part, he was never challenged. He never had to show this paper that he borrowed from another sailor. He came to this house in New Bedford. This is the Nathan and Polly Johnson house. It is now the headquarters of the New Bedford Historical Society, and you can visit it as a museum. This is where Frederick Douglass lived when he first came, and his wife, Anna, came. He was 21 years old. And right across the street from this house, it's right next to the Quaker Meeting House from the 18th century. And right across the street is the new Quaker Meeting House from 1822. That's the new one. And Frederick Douglass, who was 21, this was of course standing when he arrived, but we have a brand new statue that was dedicated in June of 23 in Abolition Row Park, because that neighborhood was full of people who were abolitionists. The last few slides, I promise. This is John Mashow, who was a person of color who had gotten away from enslavement and founded a shipyard, one of the most important shipyards of the region in, I believe, in Mount Poiset. The guy who revolutionizes the whaling industry is a blacksmith from Norfolk, Virginia, who escaped from enslavement and designed the toggle-head harpoon, which was much more effective. It wouldn't pull out of the blubber of a whale, and so the kill rate went way up, and the efficiency of whaling got much better. We have a statue of him in front of our City Hall in New Bedford. The very first African-American man to win the Medal of Honor is is William Carney. Getting tired now. William Carney, who was born in Norfolk and escapes by water. He serves in the fabled 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, that is the film about the 54th, the first black regiment. But if you look at the artwork of whaling, people of African descent are all over the artwork of whaling. Now, our eye is drawn to this guy, who's clearly having a really bad day. But I wanted to draw your attention to this guy, who's the boat steerer of another boat, a man of color who is having authority over a crew that are not people of color. And the whaling industry was an industry in which people of color could rise through the ranks to a certain extent. There were glass ceilings, but there were very few industries in the United States in the antebellum pre-Civil War period where that would have been possible. You see this again and again, these kinds of images. And so the final thing I will say with you is that the book that we worked on, and I couldn't have done the book myself, it was done with 9 other historians. It became an exhibition at the Whaling Museum, co-curated by my colleague and friend Michael Dyer. And now it's a traveling exhibition. It is currently at the Maritime Museum, the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. It's at the African Museum of Philadelphia, and it's at the College of Charleston. And it's going to be up at a couple of other places in the coming couple of years. So we're really excited that information is out there. But it's also all available online at the website of the New Bedford Historical Society. Thank you very much.